This will be my seminar presentation for critical digital literacy. The subject of the presentation is based on an article that was written by Pangrazio in 2016. However, even 5 years later, many of the issues that she discusses are relevant and timely. Pangrazio discusses in the article that in the current era, due to the absolute inundation that young people especially, but everyone in general has in our context with multimodal forms of media, namely those of social media, it's absolutely necessary for students to have the skills to understand and critically analyze these types of media. She argues in the article that a lack of fluency in understanding and conceptualizing social media in particular may lead to students being intellectually stunted due to the fact that because it is so a part of our lives, they will be missing out on a big part of life and the understanding of it. She also discusses that academic discourse up until very recently regarding social media in specific, but digital critical literacy in general, has not been effective in certain ways. These ways are that either definitions are presented about what critical literacy is that are so broad that Pangrazio argues that they don't offer much assistance in theorists, academics, and educators understanding the ramifications of critical literacy, critical digital literacy, and the importance of these things. On the other spectrum, if they are robust, they often do not understand the role that social media has to play, often linking social media to be tantamount with other types of media that preceded it. For example, television or the radio or movies or advertisements and such things. This is a absolutely inappropriate way to frame social media because it has really changed the landscape. And so for that reason, it's firmly rooted in the lives of everyone, but young people especially. They are constantly on it, whether they are online actively or they are online passively. These things exist in our homes, many different screens offering many, many different types of texts, multimodal texts that students interact with. As time progresses, an academic scholarship reconsiders these axioms about media and considers how social media is absolutely different to the media that preceded it. Certain scholars have reimagined critical literacy in ways that include social media. And this is what Pangrazio is also trying to accomplish. According to her, transcendental critique, visualization, critical self-reflection, interpretation of the modes encountered, and a rearticulation of digital concepts are all necessary components in understanding critical digital literacy on a contemporary stage. So in this way, critical digital literacy must have within it space for ideological critique and understanding. There must be an idea about how it is impacting you, the person who is interacting with it. And this is very, very important for young people to learn and consider. This reflectiveness is not necessarily something that is innate and has to be practiced. There also has to be a consideration of how things are put together when they come to you. This is the interpretation piece of it. And what are the purposes behind why it's coming to an individual in the form of media? Due to the instant nature of this, these are all very difficult tasks. And thus, it is incumbent upon educators, as well as academics, as well as parents, as well as even older siblings, to have some knowledge of this and be able to pass that inheritance on to younger people. Pangrazio argues that more research is necessary, despite her offering these different principles, really, because as of now, the previous literature that misaligns social media with other types of media may be more prevalent. It is more established, it is more researched, it is more available. She does, however, at the end of the article, offer several questions that may help future researchers and theorists guide their study in terms of which ways to go and which ways not to go. This includes things like, what exactly, now that we find ourselves in this situation, is critical literacy? Because if critical literacy is something that is necessarily informed by what exists in the society to be literate about and critical about, then it's a constantly fluid situation. She also argues that it is important to understand how youth critically assess digital media. What do they think about it? What do they think about their role in it? And it's also imperative to investigate the consequences of a notion of critical literacy that excludes ideological critique, which is something that she, going back to her first point, is against. The thoughts that I had regarding this text were, I found it a very interesting article, specifically because this gap in the literature that she mentions, which I don't want to overemphasize because I'm not necessarily very knowledgeable about this topic in the slightest. However, the fact that I read this and it was so novel to me makes me feel like perhaps that gap in the literature is as stark as she says. I agree that the intelligentsia in general, and this is not from reading necessarily, but in terms of just different people that I encounter that belong to an older generation, whether they be in positions of educational authority or not, they have misunderstood what the ubiquity of social media means. It provides an entirely different dispensation that thus far we don't know about, we don't understand, and it requires reflection and study. Also, if that's true, then a new conception of critical digital literacy that accurately reflects what young people undergo on a daily basis with the multimodal media they encounter through social media. This is very important to ascertain because it's extremely helpful and important for educators to understand what their students are going through and figure out programming that they can create or adapt that is relevant to it. Because if educators are ignorant about the day in, day out of their students in terms of social media and what it means and how it's different and what it may be like to grow up in a situation where social media is prevalent, rather than us who came to it later in life, they may waste their time and efforts doing things that are inefficient. The critique that I had, and do not agree is a strong word for this, but I had trouble believing with absolute certainty that the ideas that she posits are necessarily factual. I understand that because it is an academic paper, that arguments are posed and those arguments are defended, but considering the 5 things that Pangrazio mentions, these 5 things don't necessarily, they're not elucidated that much. She mentions them a paragraph or 2 for each. And so for this, I feel like the basis of this article being something that is contemplative and almost like a very smart person thinking out loud, regardless of the fact that she's very knowledgeable about the literature, where there are gaps, where there are progressions. It's an exploratory analysis. And therefore, it doesn't necessarily give me, as a prospective educator, a methodical plan on how to manage this issue. I also found that this is something that was missing from the article, my place in it. It's touched upon, but it's not stressed. As a teacher, a future teacher, what is my place if what the arguments that are being made are true? What is my place in it in terms of speaking to and interacting with my students, their parents, and other people regarding how these things should be dealt with? And I speak about this later, so I will tip the bit and say that perhaps this is like a naive perspective, but I do feel like students have some place, young people specifically have some place in helping us understand how to understand them. And this is something that I found missing from the article. There are a lot of ideas, but there are not necessarily proofs which could have been implemented. She could have created some kind of experimental design that gave some authority to the things that she said. And then also, it's very theoretical. And so it seems to necessarily ignore the actors in the situation. The way that this relates broadly to education as a whole, pedagogy as a whole, is that she mentions that newer conceptions of critical literacy and critical digital literacy have included things about one's relation to power dynamics and differentials. And I think that this particular issue, in our context, with how divisive things have been and continue to be politically, socially, economically, this is more germane now than it ever has been, and it's more germane in a Western context, specifically a multicultural Western context, because of a lack of homogeneity. So in this environment, social media has in front of our eyes become a battleground, something that is as divisive as something like Fox News or whatever, in calling to and proselytizing certain conceptions about the world, and doing so very convincingly without a lot of academic veracity and proof. This is something that the students need to figure out how to deal with. And that's where the educator is absolutely vital, because inaction on the part of the educator may cause the students, many of them, to not gain these skills. These are things that affect people of every single age. It's not something that youth are particularly vulnerable to, but everyone else is free of. The WhatsApp forwards and TikTok stories that are necessarily political in one way or another, and do not open a dialogue, but rather give talking points, is something that everyone is impacted by. And while we did not grow up in this, they are. So perhaps as educators, we can create some kind of action plan so that we can equip them with the skills that they need to traverse this very, very dark terrain. Dark in terms of the fact that we haven't done it before. Questions to further explore. So I had a few ideas about the ramifications of the philosophies posited in this article, even though the article is not something that I disagree with. First of all, and I mentioned this earlier, but like, how do educators, researchers, and guardians, whether they be parents, siblings, etc., utilize the philosophical and theoretical ideals espoused by well-trained and competent academics like Pangrazio, and then use those to create practical solutions to the problems that they see? How can we mobilize using these things? So we know we have the insight, but we don't necessarily have an action plan. How are we going to do that? This is something that merits reflection. And then additionally, just tying it to something that is current. What about the things on social media that are harmful, like racism or sexism, these things that are so commonplace? If you go into the right channels, right, you can find them easily. Or not factual. Pseudoscience falls in here, conspiracy theories fall in here, or biased, just kind of like proclaiming a particular viewpoint as the correct hegemonical viewpoint. Is it then appropriate in a liberal democracy such as Canada for governmental bodies to inspect and, if necessary, excise these views from the internet? Is that appropriate? And if it is, what are the ramifications of this type of censorship? Like, what does that mean about what we understand the government to do? Because this is something that I would assume the government wouldn't do, because this is not something that seems to be in line with our ideals. However, like, Twitter has done this, right, with the anti-vax movement. Facebook has done this with the anti-vax movement. Twitter did it with the conspiracy that Biden did not win the election a few months ago, and Trump did, right? They put disclaimers, they banned people, etc. If the government can't, if the government can't do things like this, what are the ramifications for our understanding of the state? If the government can't do things like this, then what is necessary for educators to know, understand, and practice that will assuage the risk of youth falling into these echo chambers? And when I say that, I don't mean to put one ideology over the other. I'm saying any of them, any of the echo chambers, whether they be leftist or right, like far right, whatever they are. an echo chamber, like an environment that necessarily promotes confirmation bias. Those exist on every single side of every single issue. Another question that I think that is important to think about is, and I mentioned this earlier, how important is the involvement of students? We're going through this and we're trying to figure it out, and we don't know it because we haven't done it yet. And we're trying to understand what it may be like to be a young person. And you've never not known about the internet. We, like, adults of a certain age, there was a time when there was no internet, and now there is. And then there was, sorry. But young people don't have that conception. The minute they were born, they were in an environment where the internet existed and it was available, and it became more and more available. Do we dialogue with young people, whether that's our students or kind of organizations that young people frequent? What is their role in this? Because I fear that if we make all the decisions without some kind of mutual consultation with them, we may not be doing the most efficient things, or it may take us longer, especially in academic settings, to come up with, codify, and then propagate the best way forward. So by the time that we get to it, it may be irrelevant already. And then this may be a view that is naive, because on some level, students are students. They lack a certain degree of experience. I don't believe this to be true, but I'm just saying that that's an argument that can be made. Thank you so much for listening.